All right, well, let's get started with at least the housekeeping sort of things. First of all, thank you everybody for being here today, for joining us. Thank you to everyone on the roundtable as well for being here, for editing policies and philosophies. That's the roundtable that we're in right now. Thank you to the Humanities Podcasting Network for organizing this and for everyone involved in planning in this symposium. Can you hear me okay? I'm sort of in an awkward spot. Oh, okay, just because I just moved. So for today's roundtable, first of all, we're going to do, thanks for the thumbs up. First of all, we're going to do a quick round of introductions, then get into a few discussion questions or topics that we sort of drafted up ahead of time. And then, of course, in the last part of the roundtable, we'll open it up to a wider Q&A or a discussion with anyone who's in attendance who wants to discuss. I already said the session's being recorded. Closed captioning is available using the button that should be at the bottom of your screen that says live transcript, so feel free to turn that on. Feel free also to use the chat function throughout this session to add your questions, your thoughts, your reactions as we go along at the end or throughout the roundtable. Depending on what happens or what's going on in there, I will try to highlight some of the discussion that's coming out of there. Okay, so to start the round of introductions, I'm Jessica McDonald. My pronouns are she, her. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. I just realized I have to copy something here. There we go. Sorry. If you're somebody who's non-Indigenous but living on Indigenous land, or if the practice of land or territory acknowledgements is new to you, I'm going to just share a resource here in the chat, which is kind of a starting point for where you can go to see other resources actually linked throughout it about pairing land acknowledgements with action, such as contributions of time and money or advocacy toward land back. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Simon Fraser University, but I'm working remotely here in Saskatoon. My research is on literary and cultural depictions of places of retail and travel like Walmart or like airports. And my podcast is called Teachin' Books, and it combines interview and solo episodes. And it's all about the ways that people teach, learn, and work with literature. And we'll get started, I think, Olivia, with the next intro.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Jessica, for chairing. I want to just warn everyone, I have dogs in the room with me that bark sometimes, so I apologize in advance if there is an interruption from them. I am Olivia Branscum. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University. I work in philosophy, in the philosophy department. I work on the history of philosophy, primarily Margaret Cavendish and Anne Conway and their theories of mind and body. For my podcasting work, I am the producer of How to Read with Milan Terlunen, who is the founder and main voice you'll hear on How to Read if you ever listen to How to Read. I believe he is here in the panel. And then I also am an interviewer and producer for New Voices in Philosophy, which is a project of the Extending New Narratives in the History of Philosophy grant that's being run out of Simon Fraser by Lisa Shapiro. So that's me, that's my experience with podcasting. Happy to be here.
Liz, did you want to go?
Hello, my name is Liz Covart. I'm a historian of early America who specializes in the American Revolution, and I work as the digital projects editor at the Omohundro Institute at William and Mary. I'm also the creator, host, and executive producer of Ben Franklin's World. It's a podcast about early American history. It's won the Best History Podcast Award for history podcasts, and it's just entered its 8th year of production. So that's a bit about me.
JF.
Yes, hello. I'm JF Martel. I'm a writer, podcaster, and television documentary director, filmmaker. I co-host a podcast called Weird Studies with Phil Ford of the University of Indiana Bloomington. I I wrote a book called Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice. I am not an academic, but a freelancer. And I am very happy to be able to take part in this discussion. Thank you very much.
And Martin. Sorry, I'm so sorry, Stacey. I just see on my list that I missed you in the order, but so let's do Stacey and then Martin.
Sure, yeah, no worries. I figured you'd get to me eventually on the screen anyways. So hi everyone, I'm Stacey Copeland. I am a PhD candidate in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, but I'm currently working and living in Toronto, Canada, which is on the treaty lands of the Mississauga of the Credit and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. And my research is really focused on radio and podcasting, coming from a media production background. I worked in radio for a few years before going back to grad school because I love teaching. And from this point forward, a lot of my focus is on looking at histories of radio in Canada, particularly queer and feminist approaches to the production of radio. And I'm working a lot in podcasting. So right now I am the supervising producer and project manager of the Amplify Podcast Network, which is run by Han McGregor, who I'm sure seen around some of the sessions yesterday. And I'm formally the supervising producer of the Spoken Web podcast. So I helped produce the first 2 seasons of that podcast as well. So happy to be here and talking about editing practices.
Hi all, I'm Martin O'Connor, and like JF, I'm not an academic, I'm a librarian, and but my academic background will be sociology. I'm a postgrad in sociology a long time ago. And I'm currently the communications coordinator at University College Cork, which is in the south of Ireland. My podcast experience would actually come from 4 years of running a show called Shush, Sounds from UCC Library, which we basically use as an engagement tool and its promotion tool for the library. Actually helps us market the library. It's basically a music and a library podcast. So there's normally 40 minutes of music in a show, and then there will be 20 minutes of library news or interviews with library staff, or and small slots on our library resources. It's another way for us just to market our resources out to academics and staff. The show itself, because of the music, has got quite a following outside the library, with certain audiences of a certain age, you know, kind of with people in their 40s who were brought up in the 80s, and there's a lot of that type of music. So I'll be coming from a really different background to everybody else on the panel, so I'm really excited to hear what's happening in a world outside the libraries. And I've spoken too much now, so I'll throw it back to Jessica.
No, I was just thinking the same thing, that I love that the diversity of perspectives that we're going to be getting here today. And I'm really excited to hear from you more, all of you, about editing practices, I guess. So like I said before, we had sort of come up with 3 general topics to talk about, starting from the basics. And by the basics, I mean, my question that I'll throw out here to all of you is, what does it really mean to edit a podcast, or what kind of work is involved in the process of editing? Because I suspect this might look quite different depending on what kind of podcast and where you're coming from and your policies or philosophies. So I don't know who wants to start us off, but maybe somebody could take a stab at what does it mean to edit? What does the work of editing involve?
Should I start? Liz, did you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, my background is in filmmaking, so obviously editing is a big part of the production process in film and television. And there was I've brought a lot of those kind of skills and philosophies to podcast editing. What does it mean to edit? That's a good question, because it's not the same thing. Editing a podcast isn't the same as editing a text or editing a film. For us, what we want to do in our podcast is do only as much editing as is necessary to let the kind of, let's call it the kind of ideal conversation that our clumsy back and forth kind of was hinting at, trying to draw that out. So it's a lot of cleaning up the ahs and ums, but also making structural changes to give the conversation the shape that it seems to want to have. And so a lot of the work we do is a kind of polishing work, but we do several passes every time. And I really believe that editing is one of the things that makes our podcast work. But it's always a matter of seeing it as, it obviously isn't what it is in film, where you're constructing something through editing. It's more like sculpture or something. You're trying to whittle down to take out noise and just increase the signal to noise ratio through the editing process. So that's how I see the function of editing in podcasting.
I like to describe podcast editing as kind of a spectrum. Like on one far end, you have record and release where there's zero editing. And on the other hand, you have the stuff coming from like NPR and the BBC and other podcast networks where it's highly, highly produced. Usually these places come out of a radio narrative storytelling kind of background. For Ben Franklin's world, the program's focus is on conveying high quality historical scholarship to non-historians. So these are people who have a great interest in history, but they're not necessarily people who have a strong background in historiography or the debates and things that are going on within the profession about early American history. And so when I edit an interview, I'm always thinking about, is there something I can do to improve the order and the flow of things that are said? So like JF, we take out ahs and ums. I take out lost trains of thought. I take out extraneous statements of politics. You know, I come from a public history background working for the National Park Service in the United States. And we learned that all of our taxpayers are your customers. So you don't want to necessarily get into politics. And there was a period for a few years when Donald Trump was president that guests would just kind of make these extraneous comments about something political. And so I would take those out because we do have a listener base that spans all sorts of, the political spectrum here in the US. But, there was one scholar who made a point about comparing a Donald Trump policy to something historical. And so that stands. So it's just trying to make the flow of information easy to digest. So we don't have to dumb anything down. History is complex and we want listeners to understand that complexity. So anything that I can do in that realm, that's how I approach editing.
Already through both of you answering that question, and of course I'm sure other folks have more to say, but I'm just getting a sense of how different our editing practices are going to be because and how much editing practices align with the particular podcast or project in question. Because for Teachin' Books, my podcast, one of my sort of back end, like in the back of my mind, editorial, I guess, values is I actually don't take out a lot of ums, ahs, or like misspoken words because I try to show or be transparent about the hard labor of thinking, especially spontaneous on your feet dialogue form thinking. And I want to bring that into a scholarly podcast and really show that it's hard to say things or to find the language, as I'm struggling to find language right now as I speak. And also I've sort of embraced the idea of being a little bit unpolished. So JF, when you were talking about polishing, editing is polishing, just for my particular podcast, I've written and talked about it being unpolished as a deliberate strategy of scholarly podcasting, like allowing that lack of polish in for kind of political reasons, honestly, to show that, to be transparent about all of this sort of hard thinking about teaching and learning that my guests are doing on the podcast.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to interject quickly. Sorry, that I agree with that. And if you listen to my podcast, you'll notice that we leave in plenty of ahs and ums. It's just that it gets so experimental sometimes that I think we're so out in left field that we need to do something. But I fully agree with what you just said, for the record.
I find it so interesting to hear that, Jessica, because that is a place that Milan and I have reached in our editing practice. But when we started out working together on How to Read, and full disclosure, the podcast existed before I joined. When I started working with Milan on How to Read, we were very focused on trying to make the conversation as clear and accessible as possible, because, like as Liz was describing, our audience consists at least in part of people who are not experts, maybe not even academics, or have no experience in academia. And we're very aware of that in the editing process, of course. And early on, one way that we tried to kind of make things clearer for our audience was to eliminate disfluencies or mistakes in speech or whatever. And after a couple of years of conversation and always rethinking the way that we do things, we reached the conclusion that, like you were saying, we actually wanted to leave some of that stuff in to model for people, especially people who aren't part of a scholarly community, that scholarship doesn't come out, or that scholarly ideas don't come out perfectly edited. Professors don't speak in paragraphs copied and pasted from their most recent journal articles. And we want that to be clear to our listeners. At the same time, when we're trying to make the conversation, clear enough that it can be followed, there is still a lot of work that happens, rearranging the conversation, like JF was saying, to try to make sure that the flow of ideas is legible, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's just so interesting to hear people's different approaches, because our own approach has changed a lot over the years that we've been doing How to Read. And I can see a lot of similar concerns and ideas reflected in what other people are saying.
I'd love to jump in here. So I definitely come at it from a bit of an in-between approach. So a lot of my current research is thinking about critically questioning the production norms and what we consider professional production techniques in radio and podcasting, because that is how I was trained too. So thinking about, what's actually behind what voices and what sounds we deem authoritative, authentic, what we deem to be credible research or credible voices in those spaces, and how editing plays into those understandings. And so in my own editing practice, I kind of find myself in a place where I keep in, I think, a lot around the same approaches that sounds like Olivia and JF are taking, where they leave in some but take out others for clarity purpose and for flow. Because again, when we're listening to something like a podcast, we are coming in with certain expectations about what it's going to sound like. So negotiating how far you can go with being unedited if the rest of the podcast sounds like it might be in a certain genre or format, that listeners are coming with a certain expectation and what they're going to hear in that space. And so I've been thinking a lot in my own approach. So the research I'm doing now, I'm using audio documentary or podcasting, right? Podcasting becoming a podcast once it's actually out there as a podcast, but audio documentary as part of my process. So I'm also thinking about, what are the spaces that we're recording in? What does it sound like when we're using our editing practices to take away the space and place that we're actually having these conversations in, which I'm increasingly finding a norm in a lot of the more professionalized practices of research podcasts, when early on we were hearing a lot more of that kind of DIY punk, people in a room together with an iPhone sound. And what are we losing in bringing in more professional radio style sound in our editing practices?
I'm happy to jump in here now as well. I'm probably, our show is quite ramshackle, and in term time, I record a show live in a radio studio on campus radio. So I very much, what's captured in that hour is what's shared. And I will occasionally interview library staff outside of the studio, because there are people who don't like being in a radio studio and having themselves recorded. So I say to them, I can record an interview with them and I can do it again and again until they're comfortable with it. But our show is quite structured. So I probably do the pre-edit, or I probably edit prior to the show. And because it's going out on campus radio, I know to be aware there are certain issues, like what Liz was saying, there will be certain topics I won't raise, and there'll be certain issues I won't raise because I'm actually representing the library. So, but over the 19 months of COVID, from March until last year, I was recording at home, and there was a bit more editing there. Where I might interview somebody, and then I would re-edit the introduction or the conclusion. But what I find works well for our show, well, it's the kind of ramshackle nature of it actually suits the show, and I try and come across a show that the library staff are approachable, we're friendly, and we're just like you saw. There's not a lot of editing goes into it. It's really basic, and it's an hour in and hour out, and it's actually quite easy to do. And because we're recording in a radio studio, there's really good equipment. It actually sounds polished, except the work that goes into the editing, there's not an awful lot of it. So, yeah.
I'm loving how our discussion is already sort of joining all three of the topics I know we wanted to talk about today, which is not just what is editing. And by the way, I wanted to point out that Liz proposed that editing is part of the art of podcasting in the chat. And I thought that was an interesting way to frame it, that of course we can talk more about. But yeah, we're talking about what is editing. We're also at the same time talking about sort of our ethical or political motivations behind what we edit, which I know was the second topic we wanted to address today. And then we're also getting into the material and editing realities, the sort of nitty gritty, where are we recording? What are we using to record? So already our discussion is ranging in ways that I think are good for this roundtable. The one thing I wanted to say, and this maybe gets more towards or kind of comes back to what a few of you were saying about political reasons, or in my case, ethical reasons why you might leave something in or edit it out. I wanted to qualify that while my own editing philosophy, part of my art of editing podcasts, is for my particular project to leave in a lot of those, the ums and ahs and everything we were talking about. A larger guiding principle for me is for my interview episodes, I try to do a very consent forward, consent anchored process, which means that so far, any edit that the guest requests, literally anything, I will do. So that means I've actually had one guest in particular have a list of about 2 pages of ums and ahs that they wanted edited out. And I went ahead and did those edits, because for me, it's sort of like different levels of editing philosophy or practice. And the top one is that I'm not out to like trap my guests or make them look bad. I realize that these are guests that are often precariously employed and trying to get a job and that sort of thing. So if they have a list of 40 ums that they want me to take out, that vetoes on top of my own sort of personal editing policy. That's something I just wanted to qualify, to be clear about and upfront about. And I'm interested to hear what other folks think about the sort of ethical motivations that guide what they leave in or take out of their podcast episodes.
Can we just stop for a moment to talk about the power of editing software? I don't know what kind of DAWs everyone's using, but you'll find that if you can find the right inflection and whatnot, if you're pretty clever, you could actually edit someone to say anything that they've said on your podcast. So one thing that I'm conscious of is, while I'll edit things for flow, I do not alter ideas. That is not my place. If we're doing a narrative style podcast, which we've started to do in the last couple of years, we're not changing ideas, but we're looking for what did the people say and how can we craft a story around that. And if we disagree with something, we try to bring that up in our narration, but still let the disagreement air as part of the person's presentation of the material that we're talking about. But I think the ethics of editing is something that doesn't get talked about enough, given the fact that, I mean, we could all be really producing deep fakes sort of thing from the audio that we record.
I have a question based on what you said there, Liz, and it'll probably apply to the academics more than JF. I know I'm constrained because I'm presenting for the library. In terms of your departments and heads, are you allowed to podcast what you want to podcast, or would there be controls coming from the institution or departments? I ask because I'm curious. Yeah, so.
Olivia or Stacey, did you want to talk about this? If you are able to sort of podcast whatever you want, or if you're sort of controlled by any higher power?
Sure. I mean, I feel like maybe I'm in a different situation because of the department I'm in as well. So I'm in communication and media studies. So making a podcast and working with audio isn't all that wild of a thing to do compared to if I was in a different discipline. And so in that sense, most of the work I'm doing now for my PhD, for instance, is very open. They're fine with me experimenting with the practice, and what happens. On the flip side, with the Amplify Podcast Network project that Han McGregor runs, who's also in the room, with that project, we are really negotiating and thinking through what it means to make podcasts as scholarship, and we'll be putting them through a peer review process as well. So I'll probably have some more interesting notes on editing as we move through that process, and what that looks like when we start to ask other academics in the field what their feedback is on the content and form of those shows.
I wanted to just return briefly to Liz's point, because I think that it's such a good guiding principle to try to adhere to, namely, not changing ideas. But I think about this a lot coming from a philosophy background, like, how do we know we're not changing ideas? How do we know that we're understanding people the way that they wanted to be understood? And sometimes new ideas come out, right? And that's something that we really encourage with How to Read, is sort of like capturing that moment of a new idea being expressed, or finding voice in resonance of different parts of the episode that like we didn't even see as resonating with one another until editing happened or something like that. So I just think that I don't think it's a terrible thing by any means, and I don't think that it undermines the project of trying to, as a goal, make sure that we're not butchering people's ideas. But I do think that it's part of this like really legitimate work of editing as an intellectual practice. And I think that it is one of the things that makes editing really rewarding for me as a scholar, because it really relates to the work that I do in history of philosophy, reading these texts and trying to understand, what did this person mean? What are other ways of understanding them that might be more charitable or whatever? And I just wanted to raise that as not even a complicating point, but just a point to highlight like really how nuanced and effortful editing can be as a process.
Just going off of that, I had an example just earlier this week where I was editing a very small, short moment of an interview where the interviewee or the guest was like a white settler who was trying to articulate their relationship to Black Lives Matter. And there was a lot of ahs, like misspoken words, like this guest was clearly reaching for the language. And as an editor, I was thinking, removing those things, like removing where the guest was reaching for that language would have political implications, right? If I removed those. That being said, if the guest asked me to remove them, I'm probably going to in the end, right? But they might not. And, the leaving that sort of reaching for language about something where you have like political commitments to it, such as Black Lives Matter, especially for somebody as a white settler speaking from that position, that's its own kind of ethical editorial consideration. JF, I think you unmuted, and I just, want to give you a chance.
Yeah, I just want to we're talking about podcasting, but of course, podcasting is it's a very broad field. It includes all kinds of things, and I think if we're talking to people who are getting into podcasting or interested in how you create a podcast, I mean, there's the whole question of, like, as a McLuhanite, I would say the whole question of medium and form and genre becomes very, very important too. and has its own aesthetic and political and ethical implications. That question, like, are you making a podcast aimed at business people, how to improve the bottom line? Are you making a podcast for tennis aficionados, or I don't know, butterfly hunters? Each of these cultures will have its own dictates, but there is something about podcasting that kind of unites all those things. And I've been thinking a lot about what the essence, let's say, of podcasting might be. And of course, I don't have the answer, but it seems to me to have something to do with conversation. It seems to me like there's a connection between some idea of authenticity and podcasting. And that would distinguish it from older, more mass communication based kind of media. But of course, that's my personal view. But it seems like depending on what your aims are with your podcast, it's going to dictate a kind of editorial policy. Even if you won't find it written down anywhere, it's going to come implicitly with all kinds of expectations, and ums and ahs might not be great in the boardroom, right? So if you want to emulate a boardroomish language, you're going to adopt a different editing policy. One of the philosophy podcasts that I used to listen to a lot is Partially Examined Life, where I find it hyper edited to the point where they eliminate even hesitations sometimes, or at least they used to do that. And it's very kind of like machine gun kind of like dialogue going and it's all about the idea, the content of the ideas. So you can see a particular approach to philosophy in that show that makes sense if you're someone who's accustomed to traditional kind of philosophical discourse in Western, but like the question of what's your culture and what community are you communicating with and part of becomes a huge aesthetic, political, and ethical question when you're creating a podcast.
Fellow McLuhanite over here, JF, so I feel that. But I wanted to kind of flip the question on Martin too, because, I'm speaking from a graduate student perspective as well. So there's maybe less investment or nervousness in the department if I do something that is more experimental, say in comparison to Hannah in the chat is talking about how she has experienced a bit of issues because of people affiliating her podcast work with her department. And so I was curious, have you had that sort of experience, Martin, if you don't mind me asking, and how has that informed your editing practice?
We have a library director who's really supportive of new ideas. So I basically had to make I had to make a business case for doing this show, and it was basically, I said, there's so much information that's been thrown at students and staff that a lot of what we're sending out is getting lost. So we try something a little bit different, because campus radio is actually played all around campus. So it's into coffee shops, it's into bars, it's into shops, it's everywhere where our users are. So there was no resistance. Once I got the library director on board, I had no resistance to it. There are colleagues who are going, why are you doing this? We're librarians, we're not. And it's a fun show. And it's an hour, and the way I see it is, there's library news, which is like the there's library content, which is like the medicine, and then the music is like the sugar. So this is just a way to. So I was able to sell it. This is just another forum for us getting our message out there, and it's gone down really well in the library community. So now there are libraries all over who know that UCC Library do a radio show. So it's raised our profile. So once I got the library director on board, I was fine. But I did have to make a fairly good business case with her. And there are colleagues who think it's a waste of time and it's a waste of staff time. I don't think it is. But so I'm not sure if I've answered your full question, or if you want to reiterate again, I can. Yeah.
That partly answers it. I was also curious, did it actually inform the editing choices that you made in your show?
It does, because I'm representing the library. There'll be certain music I can't play. Anything that has a hint of racism, has a hint of sexism, has a hint of phobia, I'm not able to go near that. I have a list of tracks which I have built up and I've called it a playlist. It cannot be played on shush. And it's music that there's a certain type of music we play. It would fit in really well in terms of the music, but in terms of the library voice, it would not. So it does impact. What mainly impacts on editorial policy is how does it make the library look? And so if I was doing the show on my own, I would probably have a different slant, or I might have a different slant. But the fact that I'm the voice of the library, it does really preempt what I'm going to play, what sort of interviews I'm going to do. So yeah. Okay.
Everything you're saying, Martin, kind of reminds me of a few things that are going on in the chat, which are about not necessarily editing voices or language or what people are saying, but also editing. This is initially a question by Jared, but then brought again up by Catherine. And I think, Liz, you might have just spoken to it, so you could also maybe start us off here. But the question is about how we, or what our approach is to editing sort of non-diegetic sounds. I'm thinking of even sips of water. I wrote recently in something that, sometimes an audible sip of water is, in the finished product of my own podcast episodes, and kind of who cares? Actually, people really do care, I know, but kind of who cares, because it's too much labor sometimes to take out every sip of water, and I'm thirsty. So I'm curious to know, Liz, maybe if you could start us off about your approach to editing those non-diegetic sounds. Doesn't have to be a sip of water, but tone, spatial sounds, that kind of thing.
I mean, one way that I edit that right is by determining the pacing of the podcast. When we're all really excited about ideas, we'll make a really important part and then we'll just speed past it. Or sometimes people pause and linger, and the thought that they pause and linger on, isn't necessarily like the meat of what is said. So sometimes I'll shorten spaces or split something that was entirely connected, just to let listeners have a space to think about something. In terms of adding sound, I was really slow to add sound to my podcast. First, there is this philosophy where you can overuse sound, and that you can use it as a crutch, to take care of a not as well worded script as you'd like, trying to do the effort and heavy lifting that your narration should actually be doing. So I wanted to make sure I got that skill down of narration and writing scripts and that sort of thing down before I added music. But then the more I read about different philosophies of adding sound effects and music, it can really just alter the way that people hear and understand information when you add extra sound. So if you don't pick the exact right music track, like a lot of NPR in the workshops I've attended, they always try to go for neutral, because if something's just a bit too upbeat or a bit too downbeat, then people will say on the downbeat, oh, that's not great information, it's not good information, or I feel sad about hearing it. Or if it's a little upbeat, they can feel better about hearing it, and maybe that was more fun information. So adding sounds can impact how people hear things, and I think you need to be really careful. Also, I think what's great about audio is that, like reading, it's a form of active learning. So when you watch video, it's like a passive act in the brain, but listening to audio, it activates your brain. And so just like when you're reading, when you're hearing an audio story or an interview, you're making pictures in your mind. So you want to make sure when you add sound effects, right, that you've taken the time to think about, well, what is the picture I want people to form in their mind before we add it. So I don't have a formula for how to do this. I was slow to add and found that you just kind of have to practice it. But those are some of the things that I really think about before I add sound to the podcast, of what do I want people to think and feel? What are the mental images I want them to evoke in their minds when I'm telling this story by using this sound?
I want to go back to the idea. I agree with you. Like we in our podcast, Liz, we did the same thing. We just slowly, progressively started adding kind of elements or allowing certain elements that we used to edit out to exist. For instance, we often go looking for books to read a page from something, like during the show. So we won't leave in the entire period where I'm rummaging through books trying to find the one I want to read from, but we may leave a little bit. We may leave in the part where it's like, oh, that just reminds me of something. Let me just, and then we'll have a bit of that background sound and then flipping pages, and then I'll start reading, or Phil will do the same. So we leave some of that kind of just to add some spatiality and some I don't know, some drama, I guess, to the conversation. Like these are two people talking in their respective spaces. It's not just these aren't just disembodied voices. So that and working with silences, I think that's so important. I find that there's a tendency often in podcasts to try to eliminate silences to keep the information flowing. And I find that allowing yourself to or allowing those silences to exist lets the podcast breathe a little bit, and it doesn't. So that's a good thing. As for non-diegetic sound music and that sort of thing, I find that it's all about, we're lucky enough, we have a composer on our show, Pierre Martel in Montreal, and he'll give us new pieces every few weeks or sometimes few months. And for us, the music is really kind of a counterpoint to the conversation. It's a way to create this kind of open space in the show where reflection can take place, or people can go into the washroom maybe, or go grab another cup of coffee, or so it's kind of like this rhythmic tension and release thing that includes the conversation and the music and all of the elements. You want to create, at least what we try to do is create a kind of dynamic, kind of almost kind of a respiration, a kind of a rhythm to the show where there's this tension and then a release. We really approach the whole show aesthetically as something that should work on its own, should stand on its own as a kind of I don't know, dialogic painting or something. That's how we think of it. And so all those decisions will be made in accordance with that kind of ideal that we have.
This is such a great question because, when you're working in larger industry, you say you work for a CBC or an NPR, like a national broadcaster or large private media house, you'll have an editor who is really focused on the content, as in the dialogue that's happening and how the story flows and the narrative. And then you'd have a sound designer, post-production person, and a composer or musician that works on the show, right? But in reality, in the podcasting world, a lot of podcasts, the editor is the producer, is the composer, is the sound designer. And so it all kind of overlaps together. And so for me, there's a lot of really interesting points that come up around flow and thinking about our editing practice and how we train ourselves maybe over time to think through sound as we're listening to the episodes that we're editing. And of course, it depends on the genre and form that you're deciding to have this particular podcast take. It's different if you're working on a audio drama versus a conversational roundtable might not have the same kind of rich ambient sound, unless that's what you're going for, right? And so thinking about making those choices as you listen through, for me, it's usually I'll do a listen through the narrative and the stories first, always dialogue driven for me. It's just the way my brain works. But as I'm listening through, I'll listen for moments that would be benefited through some sound design or some music to help punctuate the points that I'm trying to get across. And that's just through, I think, repetition and figuring out the style and tone that I want the show to be, and starting to weave those in underneath and see what I think of them. And so, yeah, and the point on silence, I think, is really important to pause on too, because that's what happens in natural conversation. And that's how we actually digest what's going on in a conversation, is having those natural pauses. And it's something that I find a lot of folks, when they're first getting into editing, will just cut them all out, cut out all of those long pauses, cut out all of the breaths, mash it together, and then it's a bit too overwhelming and you just can't quite digest the conversation that's happening. So I tend to even add extra space sometimes, especially if it's someone who's a bit of a fast talker like me, to add that time for listeners to actually digest the conversation that's taking place.
We do the same thing. And actually, to Jessica's original sort of establishing comment on this question, when we were recording in person, which we haven't done much of lately, we would bring a teapot and strategically drink tea with the guests, and then even more strategically edit in the tea drinking sounds whenever we felt that we needed a pause or just a moment of reflection. Like, you know, sometimes two sections don't fit together perfectly, or we weren't able to capture a segue in dialogue, so we allow the tea to be the segue. So I actually think sometimes those sounds, those like sounds that indicate to listeners that the voices in the podcast are, you know, embodied people and having an organic conversation of a kind, I think can be really useful for creating the flow, different kinds of flow and different goals in flow, as everyone's been sort of illustrating so nicely.
Yeah, I love this strategic tea drinking, as Laura also put in the chat. And yeah, the question of audience that Liz just brought up, it's sort of been underlying and we've gotten at it peripherally, but that's another question that applies too to things that are coming up in the chat. Hannah McGregor brought up the fact that, or the moment, a point that someone made in an academic podcasting session a while ago, that academics are often suspicious of high production values, such that the more audibly produced something is, the less academic it sounds. And that relates back to what we were talking about in the very first part of this session about polish versus unpolished, and who are we aiming these podcasts for? Who is an unpolished or friendlier, maybe, or ramshackle, in your words, Martin? Who is that kind of podcast aiming for? Who's the audience for that kind of podcast? I think about my own sort of deliberate unpolishedness in the podcasts that I make. And I think, okay, I don't think I'm making that for the people who are going to hire me, because I don't know if they'll be interested in me saying all of this garbage bullshit, to be honest, about whatever, some tangent about, my shower that I had that morning. But I also think that there is a way in which, by aiming for an academic audience, I'm almost trying to like change the way that academic audiences respond to things, like respond to a kind of podcast like mine. So there's like sort of a changing of audience trying to be that I'm trying to do in the podcast. Liz, did you want to speak a little bit more to the audience question, and then maybe we can also open things up to anyone in the session who wants to ask a question or share?
I mean, I was just saying, like you said, that we've gotten at this peripherally, but I think a lot of the decisions we make are shaped by who we want to reach with our show. And then as you get into podcasting and you really get to know your listeners, you get to know what they like and what they don't like. So we did an episode about the politics of tea in the American Revolution, and we added tea sipping sounds, and some of the listeners, it drove them nuts. They're like, we don't want to hear that in the podcast. And now, like, you have to think about just the ways that everybody hears everything differently as well. Like, we can all listen to the same piece of tape, right? But we all kind of hear it differently. So I don't know. That's all I was saying, is like, audience, it plays a role in how we present our information and how we edit it together. And if I can just take a stab at Amanda's question in the chat about not feeling the same hesitancy when we edit our writing versus when we edit a podcast, I think in my case, I do approach editing my podcast kind of like writing, like, how can I get the flow? And that was very much how I got into it. But I also wonder if it has to do, like, when I record a guest, they're giving me their ideas, and I try to take special care of that. And not that I don't take special care of my own ideas, right? But they're your own ideas, so you can kind of be rough with them in a way. I'm not sure that you can feel, that you can be with someone else's ideas. So, I mean, I'm sure there's a million answers to that question, but that's kind of how I'd answer that.
Oh yeah, how I edit my solo episodes is so different than how I edit the interview. And I don't think I've even we haven't really gotten into those distinctions either. Did other folks want to speak to Amanda's question here in the chat about what Liz was answering about editing audio versus sort of editing writing and the amount of hesitancy that we have about obscuring the editing process for the audience?
Yeah, I love this comment. I was writing it in the chat, but since we're bringing it up here, I really feel like there's listener expectation and just general association still, where podcasting is so intertwined with ideas of intimacy, connection, authenticity, and dialogue in ways that, say, a journal article is definitely not. And so in that sense, there is certain expectations that the listener is coming to podcasting with, that we really do seem to have a lot of more investment in those spaces having that sort of feeling versus going to read someone's work in writing.
Totally agree.
So a couple of other things coming up in the chat here, just to draw out some more. Feel free to add any more questions if folks want to. We still have a few minutes left in this session, so happy to answer some. Oh yeah, leaving baby sounds in on which please. Yeah, so what gets left in an episode can be a political matter, can be charged with political weight, right? Like a kind of a feminist strategy in some respects. Milan asks, isn't it a good thing that podcasting pushes us to think about the invisible labor of editing that writing almost always conceals? I love that question. And it reminds me actually of some of the discussion in the podcasting as scholarship session yesterday about podcasting revealing the conditions of labor. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I was just thinking from my experience, most people don't understand audio editing, from this, at least in the world of history, right? There's a lot of people who think that it's just as easy to make a podcast as recording and then throwing it out into the world. But there's a ton of editing and decisions that go on behind the scenes. So I think conversations like the one that we're having today and all your questions in the chat really help us think about, take a moment to stop and think about all the labor that's going in. So yeah, I think it's good that we should think about the process of editing and the labor that's involved there.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that podcasting makes editing more visible than publishing, let's say, or writing. I don't know if maybe because there's a lot of I don't know, how can I say this? There's a lot of obvious editing in podcasting because it's still an emergent medium that hasn't found all of its norms, and hopefully it will remain a little bit punk for some time to come, and there'll be new things coming in. And so you can see maybe the scaffolding a bit more than you can listening to radio or reading a book. But I do find that I'm enjoying this conversation precisely as Liz was saying, because we get to reveal what seems to be largely an invisible aspect of podcasting, the editing part. Yeah.
I'm curious for Olivia and Stacey, or I guess just anyone, but people who are working through long writing projects right now, like a dissertation or whatever, at the same time as podcasting, like if you do notice a big difference between like, I'm going to edit my dissertation versus I'm going to edit this podcast.
Sure. It's interesting having these conversations because I started out making media before I started writing large pieces of academic work. So for me, there was no surprise in how much work got put into a podcast versus it was a surprise to me how much work goes into a large research manuscript, let's say. And so it's always really fascinating to me. I think a lot of the revelations around how podcasting, at least in the academic space, how podcasting shines a light on the labor behind editing practices also comes from the newness for a lot of academics in switching over to a brand new format of trying to translate their research and trying to have these conversations. And I think it goes back a lot as well to what Liz kind of touched on the different DAWs that we use. So it's not only, the thinking through and the process of it broadly, it's also the tools as well. So the different ways that the different tools we're then using change up maybe how many hours it takes or the way that we approach certain projects. And so for me, thinking about the relationship we have with the tools and technology we're using, that is also part of that thinking about labor and opening up conversations of labor question.
I find this question really hard because when I think about it, I find myself just circling around so many different thoughts and feelings about the relationship between podcast editing and my dissertation writing and editing practice. I mean, I think that one thing I can say is that working on a podcast while I'm also working on my dissertation has really made me think about the voice of my dissertation writing. And I'm someone who in writing always thinks about voice anyway. It's how I approach writing and just sort of think about expressing myself through writing, which I'm sure many people can relate to. But working on a podcast has shown me that there are like non-academic voices that I can bring in, or different kinds of academic voices that I can use in my dissertation editing and writing process to maybe not reveal the labor that goes into editing, but certainly tweak with or like kind of poke at a little bit the assumption that I mentioned a while ago that like academic writing comes out fully formed and like perfectly analytical with no mistakes and no personal elements. Because I think what could be more personal than a dissertation? And like I want that to be visible, but I think that I've really been sort of inspired in that by working on podcast.
I think that's a really good place to end your reflections on sort of how podcasting has shaped your own, practice as an academic. I mean, that's I share a lot of what you just said, and I think it's reflected in a lot of what was said today at the roundtable too, how podcasting inflects the way that we just operate in our lives elsewhere or, in other roles. So I want to say thank you so much to everybody who came to this roundtable, of course, to everybody who participated in the roundtable for sharing your insights and your expertise and your wisdom and everything else. And yeah, it was really lovely to talk to folks today and to see some faces and names. I hope everybody stays safe and takes care. I'm looking forward to the rest of the sessions today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.